Hi, friends and comrades, and welcome to another episode of the End of Sport podcast. My name is Nathan Coleman Lamb, and I am joined today by my friend Anna Posberg. Anna, how you doing in London?
Yes, in London. It's a little rainy, but very, very happy to be here and really excited for today's conversation.
Yes, I am too, because today we are joined by Madeleine Pape, who is an Olympian and sociologist at the University of Lausanne Center for Gender Studies and the Institute of Social Sciences. Her research focuses on the regulation of gender in sport, the politics of inclusion, integrity in sports governance, and the study of sex and gender in biomedical and sports sciences. Maddie, welcome to the show.
Hi, both. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, we are so excited to have you here. Since I joined the podcast, I was like, we have to get Maddie on here because you are brilliant and you have so much that you can teach us on and have a conversation with us about. And I'm so excited for today.
Well, I think we should also say that Anna's one of the experts in this space. So it's, yeah.
That's so kind of you.
I feel a bit of pressure here, a bit of pressure.
Not at all. Not at all. I learn from you every single conversation we have. But to start, I want to chat about your own experiences as both an athlete and a sociologist, because as Nathan said in the intro, you're an Olympian and a sociologist. You're a former elite runner for Australia in the 800 meter. You've competed at both the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympic Games and at the 2009 World Championships in Berlin, which back in 2019, you wrote a piece for The Guardian, and these aspects were pretty core to what you wrote about. And in this piece, you describe how your opinion has changed on the exclusion of women with high testosterone after encountering literature written by advocates of women's sports who oppose the exclusion of women athletes with naturally high testosterone for scientific and ethical reasons. But you also talk about how your opinion has changed because you befriended some women with high testosterone. Specifically, you wrote, scientific and ethical concerns aside, was I willing to recognize my friends as women outside of sport, yet deny them the right to compete alongside me on the track? The short answer, I realized, was no. And so can you walk us through a bit more in detail how the coalescence of your sociological training and your lived experience as a human shaped your opinion then and how they continue to influence your work today?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's funny. I actually didn't expect when I left Australia and headed across the Pacific Ocean to the University of Wisconsin-Madison that I would be doing anything in connection with sport, let alone in connection with gender. My career had come to a pretty rapid end because of an injury. I was unable to run. In fact, I didn't even jog for 5 years after this injury and the surgery that followed that. And I really felt the need to sort of start my life afresh and get away from my identity as an athlete and pursue, in this case, I was thinking of pursuing a PhD in connection with environmental sustainability. But it turned out that actually my history as an athlete, and especially my lived experience in 2009 and my encounter with Caster Semenya at the World Championships in Berlin, it came back into my story, I guess, while I was at Wisconsin. I took a feminist theory course. The very first book that we read was Sexing the Body by Anne Foster Sterling. And for listeners who aren't familiar with this book, it's really foundational for feminist biology. Anne Foster Sterling is a biologist by training, and in this book, she explains just how the complexity of sex has been concealed through the actions of scientists. And she actually uses an example from sport. The book opens with the example of Maria Jose Patiño, of the Spanish hurdler who was banned back in the 80s after, quote unquote, failing a chromosome test, and then follows the story of Patiño and how she fought and regained the right to compete. And it was the first I had heard of the history of sex testing in sport, even after what I had experienced in 2009, which just shows you, I think, how quickly that sort of memory had been forgotten in the sport and how little critical discussion there was around eligibility in the women's category. So I encountered this book and started quite a long process of reflection. It was not at all that I was convinced immediately that there was nothing here to how to put it, that there was nothing to my own experiences as a women athlete and my own sense that there were differences that mattered in sport. I wasn't willing to sort of abandon immediately my commitments around that, but over time I was able to really develop a new frame for thinking about difference in sport and the complexity of the women's category and of the biology related to athletic performance, but also to sex, and to eventually, be able to bring an entirely different frame to understand what I had actually witnessed in Berlin in 2009.
Yeah, appreciate that. That brings us kind of to what I always find as the person in this conversation who is not an expert on this subject. The very complicated regulatory landscape that exists with respect to trans athlete inclusion and female eligibility. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit what that current landscape is and how we got to this point? Because honestly, as many times as we go through this, I feel like I need another refresher because it's like a bit dizzying.
Gosh, yeah, it's a pretty dense history actually. So maybe instead of going, right back to the beginning, it might be easier just to. I mean, I really think that the current period started to get very interesting in the sort of mid 2010s, so around 2015. And even if we follow the evolution of IOC policy since that time, we already get a sense of how this landscape has been changing and what kinds of factors have been shaping the approaches of sports governing bodies. So in 2015, we had a really important appeal brought to the Court of Arbitration for Sport by Indian sprinter Judy Chand, which led to World Athletics rules at the time being suspended, and World Athletics being told to go away and do your homework and come up with more specific evidence to support your claim that women who have naturally elevated testosterone levels have a disproportionate advantage relative to other women. And that sort of legal pushback to the World Athletics policy was also accompanied by, in around a similar time, in the sort of late 2010s, pushback also from different UN bodies calling for sports organisations to be paying attention to human rights, that there were human rights violations occurring through eligibility rules. And in parallel, I think the scientific landscape was also getting more complex. There were starting to be more discussions around the science of athletic performance when it comes to transgender athletes, but also I think recognition that the situation of athletes with intersex variations was extremely complex and required extremely considered decisions, and that there wasn't really an evidence base that sports organisations could rely upon across all sports. So all of that led the IOC to pursue a very different process and to come up with, in 2021, a policy that was no longer a recommendation around this is what we suggest you do as sports organisations, but instead offered a set of principles for sports organisations to follow when developing policies for their own sports. And that was sort of seen by, I suppose, human rights advocates as a really positive step for sport and something that really created it gave a lot of legitimacy to the argument that actually human rights really matter and that there are harms occurring through eligibility policies, and sports organisations must be accountable for those harms and violations. At the same time, it sort of was colliding with a wider political landscape that was really starting to explode around transgender rights in particular. And this sort of like backlash against the advances of LGBTQ plus rights. And so the IOC's intervention became very divisive. And we then saw also that the Olympic movement became divided. Certain international federations were trying to align with the IOC position, and others were getting pulled by political forces and other forces to adopt positions that were entirely in contradiction of the IOC policy. So up and over the past 5 years in particular, the landscape of international sport policy has been quite, how would I call it? Conflictual, actually, which is a bit unusual for the Olympic movement. Like, these are organizations that are supposed to be aligned with one another. And yet over the past 5 years, this topic in particular has really been a source of division between the IOC and certain federations.
Yeah. And speaking of federations that kind of this conflicting approach to what the IOC principles were and the framework was in 2021, you mentioned World Athletics, and almost a year ago at this point, I think last March 2025, World Athletics had quietly put out this call for feedback because they were going to update their policy on female trans eligibility. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they had put out this, like, very quietly, we're looking for feedback on various stakeholders, interest holders, in their opinions on the female category and sex testing. And then a couple months later, they published this announcement saying that they were going to update their policy. They were going to reinstate chromosome testing with the regulations, basically saying that all athletes who want to compete in the female category at the World Championships in August in Tokyo were going to be required to undergo a once-in-a-lifetime test for the SRY gene, which they said was a reliable proxy for determining biological sex. Can you explain, just kind of walking through this process, maybe some of the problematics, or I don't know if there's any good aspects to it, but maybe the problematics and how World Athletics went about collecting this data, and also maybe their characterization of the SRY gene as a reliable proxy? Like, is that correct? Is that accurate? Is that inaccurate? Can you just kind of walk us through this case study of how they did this?
There's a lot to say about World Athletics and how their policies have evolved over time. And so, yeah,
Yes.
let's see how I go, and feel free to prompt me again if we don't get through, all the pieces. I mean, World Athletics is very interesting because over the past, really since the Judy Chand case back in 2015, their policies have really evolved rather rapidly, and they have, and in these evolving policies, we've seen sort of shifting criteria with respect to what eligibility criteria will apply to the women's category, which already in and of itself shows you that there hasn't been a clear-cut, overarching definition of advantage in the women's category and how that's going to get measured across athletes. It's, there's even been, for example, that they had one policy over the past 10 years that was focusing on specifically middle distance events in the women's category and targeting women with intersex variations within those middle distance events, but in a way that actually contradicted their own research and their own findings when they actually looked at the data and published a piece that was attempting to sort of measure the correlation between testosterone levels and performance outcomes across all the different events in the sport of track and field. And in fact, they found certain events, for example, hammer throw and pole vault, that had a higher correlation between testosterone levels and success in those events. And yet ultimately their policy didn't include those events. So there was a real, and also it included events for which they didn't even have any data, such as the mile. So we saw a real cherry picking of which events were pulled into this policy, and there was clearly a targeting of athletes with high testosterone who were competing in women's middle distance events at the time, including Caster Semenya. Where I think what's interesting with the most recent World Athletics policy is that it's trying to harmonize basically their position towards transgender athletes and their position towards intersex athletes or athletes with women with specifically a very specific variation. I'm not even probably, let's see if I can say it, 5 alpha reductase deficiency, which is, I mean, there are many, many, many different variations that exist on the intersex spectrum. So this is just one, but it's been the one that has been targeted and given the most attention from World Athletics. But they're at the moment, I think, through this new policy, the chromosome testing and subjecting all women to this mandatory chromosome test, is part of it is ensuring that there's coherence in their policy approach for transgender women and women with intersex variations. And they consider both groups to be biological males. That's their language. It's not language that is scientifically correct, or rights respecting, or respecting human dignity, I would say, and respecting the actual true identities of these athletes. But in any case, it's the language of World Athletics, and which is very violent in and of itself. But the policy is intended to sort of mark these women as now biologically distinct from other women competing in the women's category. So cisgender women without intersex variations pass the test, and other women are siphoned off and not allowed to compete in the women's category anymore. I mean, in terms of whether the SRY gene is a true indicator of athletic performance, well, of course not. Of course not. And even, the original architects of this test, which was never intended for sport. It's being developed for medical purposes, entirely separate from the world of sports performance, have themselves spoken out. And this is, we've seen this actually again and again over the decades. That often geneticists are the ones that are from outside of sport standing up and saying, "What on earth are you doing using this test for that purpose?" There is no evidence that supports the use of SRY gene testing in women's sport. But from the point of view of World Athletics, it's a very convenient way for them to be able to sort of simplify, I suppose, what has become a really thorny question for them, and a question that they would really just like to see go away.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. And the SRY gene has been soundly debunked as a really shitty way to police this boundary. And I just keep coming back to I just can't understand why, if there's so much evidence against the SRY gene testing, why World Athletics went with it. Is it just because it's convenient, or are there other reasons that you think they went this route?
I really think that, I mean, especially if we study the details of their policy and think about how it's going to be implemented, how it is being implemented already. The idea is that World Athletics pushes the responsibility for eligibility testing down to the national federations. And in the sport of athletics, there are over 200 member federations. So there's many different countries now that are responsible for implementing this kind of testing. They've been encouraged to adopt it early, to sort of be screening athletes as they're coming into elite competition. And from the point of view of World Athletics, the objective is clearly to avoid a controversy. They don't want to have to face, I guess, the reality that sex is complex at one of their major championships and have that become a distraction. This is, in their mind, something that is, well, just that they don't want to be dealing with at a major championship. And they will frame it actually as a benevolent move, in that by ensuring early testing in an athlete's career, we can protect that athlete from then having to experience the harms of the scrutiny if they, make it to the international level, and then they're sort of outed as being ineligible. So But of course, in reality, there is nothing but harm in the implementation of these policies. And we can talk more about that. But I mean, just as an example, first of all, it's highly likely that minors are being tested, having genetic screening done. We don't know what kind of genetic counselling they're receiving, or what kind of support is being provided to their families. When this is all being pushed down to it's being pushed underground by being pushed onto national federations, and in ways that World Athletics is in no position to control or regulate. So we don't know what kinds of standards are being followed when it comes to consent. We also know that in any situation, it would be impossible for any athlete to provide free consent, because their right to compete is riding on this. But in addition, whether they can even provide informed consent is probably unlikely, since, or at least it would require a significant amount of expertise and support to be provided to all of these more than 200 federations to ensure that certain protocols being followed. And in practice, this is just beyond the capacity of World Athletics to be able to manage and control.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's just really disheartening to hear that the quote unquote solution is, fucking testing children. It's, like the absolute worst elements of this abusive history of, sex testing violation, right? And gender testing violation, returning in full force. That's our answer, because organizations like World Athletics and the IOC don't want bad PR, right?
Mhm.
And that, as you've kind of indicated, and so therefore we're going to subject children to harm. It's pretty sickening stuff. But
Yeah, and I mean, just something to add to that. And I know we'll probably get to the IOC eventually, but the new president, Kirsty Coventry, has said on numerous occasions that she wants the IOC to get back to its core business, which is delivering Olympic Games. And all this other stuff, human rights, sustainability, is kind of getting in the way. So it would be much like, she doesn't want to have an event like a reoccurrence, let's say, of what happened during the Paris Olympic Games, where two boxers were called out or subjected to just unprecedented scrutiny during the Paris Games, and the IOC was really put under the spotlight. Kirsty Coventry doesn't want to have to deal with this.
yeah, well, listen, so you were getting into this before, and so I'm kind of circling back a little bit, but I think it's actually a really interesting question. That much of the, we know that much of the, I mean, we talked at great length on this show about it, rightly, that much of the current discourse has been about trans athletes, specifically trans women, and a huge part of that, just again, for any listeners who maybe have not been following, but I mean, how could you not have been, right? Because we have a much broader moral panic, right, that has been weaponized by fascist forces really across the globe, that has centered around trans people and, frankly, trans inclusion in sport, right? So that's why the discourse has centered so much on trans inclusion specifically. But historically, organizations such as World Athletics, as you've been telling us, have had separate female eligibility and transgender eligibility regulations, separate sets of regulations. But recently, some of these organizations seem to be shifting this approach, right? Such as you've been saying, that World Athletics is trying to create a single policy or a single testing procedure. Is the distinction between trans and intersex athletes important from a definitional and or regulatory perspective? And maybe what is the motivation behind or the impetus for creating a single policy rather than having these separate policies?
Well, I can tell you what part of the motivation is. I mean, I mentioned earlier that part of their project is to ensure coherence between their different policies, so that we don't have sort of one policy for transgender women that looks this way. And like, well, I mean, for example, World Athletics banned transgender women before they brought in this mandatory genetic screening policy, and had at the time, a different set of criteria for women with elevated testosterone. So this, I think, their calculation, their strategic calculation, and this is coming out of their medical department, is that if they're brought before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, they want to have the strongest case possible to support their policy position. And that's really the job of the Chief Medical Officer of World Athletics. It's not to advance science. It's not to ensure scientific integrity in how research is conducted on transgender athletes or athletes with intersex variations. His job is to protect the reputation of world athletics. Let's just be clear about that. One of the problems is that when it comes to athletes with intersex variations, there is no published literature. So, except for, or at least there's no independent published literature. There's one article that World Athletics authors or employers of World Athletics have authored, which is looking at what the study I mentioned earlier, correlations between testosterone levels and performance. So the challenge that World Athletics faces is that they have a real dearth of evidence when it comes to especially athletes with intersex variations. There are no independent studies that exist on athletic performance in athletes with naturally high testosterone levels. So how do you get around this if you're World Athletics? You basically want to maximize other sources of data available to you. And the trick that we're seeing them now pursue is by reclassifying women with high testosterone as well as trans women as quote unquote biological males. And if the Court of Arbitration for Sport accepts this logic, that then opens up all of that research comparing cisgender women and men to be leaned on as evidence. And we've even seen, actually, there was an ACSM or American College of Sports Medicine consensus position. I'm always very suspicious of the use of consensus, and Anna is the expert on that. But a consensus position on differences between cisgender women and men. Of course, it would have used the terminology of biological females and males, led by the Chief Medical Officer, Stephen Berman of World Athletics. Why? Precisely because he's trying to set up different pieces of evidence that he can rely upon if the policy comes before the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And by having a policy that sort of unifies transgender women and women with intersex variations as just part of the wider population of biological males, his argument will then be that he can rely on that, on any evidence drawn from quote unquote biological males. So it's the idea to describe women with intersex variations in particular as biological males was not a scientific idea. It actually came from Doriane Coleman and a legal perspective and a sort of a legal advice that was given to World Athletics. But now World Athletics has been able to run with it, and they're now sort of retrofitting a scientific explanation for this characterization of trans women and women with intersex variations.
Yeah, and it's just bananas how this has all been weaponized, and there's this use of scientific knowledge that is essentially opportunistically created or found to uphold these different ideas. And that's an idea that's central to your research on this contested category of female, is that of biofeminism, and which is the wielding of scientific knowledge and expertise to claim binary biological sex difference as the true basis for cisgender women's experiences and her rights. And in your work and with this idea of biofeminism, I want to actually step outside of sports for just a second, because specifically, you've written about how biofeminism manifests itself in and is at least influenced by non-sport lobby groups that attempt to conceptualize and define this relationship between sex and gender. And you've written about, and we've seen these kinds of groups, especially in the US and the UK, but really all over the world. Can you explain how these lobby groups, which are not from sport, engage with sport or opportunistically engage with sport and impact the policing of the women's category in sports, not just juridically, but also epistemically as well?
Yeah, and I guess my own language in this space has been evolving, and I'm not sure actually how I characterize this variety of feminism anymore. Um, but yeah, biofeminism is a term that I've used for basically a variety of feminism that is invested in a biological definition of womanhood, and which then seeks the sort of scientific justification for this definition. It's obviously overlapping a lot with gender critical feminism. Perhaps some listeners will be familiar with gender critical feminism, especially as that's been unfolding in the UK context. And the UK has been one of my main focuses, actually, because I just find it really curious, like how this fuss, which is much more impactful than just fuss. Like it's really this polemic, let's say, around transgender women in particular has unfolded in the UK, and the role that certain cisgender women have played in that process. And what's been interesting is to see how sport started to become a useful institutional domain for these groups to mobilize around. We can trace their roots to sort of radical feminism, which was much more influential in the UK than it was in the US. Like in the US, it's more sort of a liberal feminism, intersectional feminism. There's a different landscape. In the UK, radical feminism is the dominant feminism, and that means that topics like violence against women, pornography, these are sort of the primary topics, and it's all, of course, constructed around the essential male perpetrator. And they didn't care about sport, right? Like radical feminists have never engaged. Well, I mean, yes, that's not true. There are radical feminists that try to reimagine a version of sport that is built around women and feminine values and is divorced from masculine structures and so on and so forth. Yes, that exists, but it's not the dominant. It's not the dominant form of feminism, and it's not the dominant topic. Sport is not the dominant topic for radical feminists. So it was very interesting to see how sport was taken up by this, gender critical movement in the UK. And of course, it's not only feminist actors; it's also many different conservative actors that have taken up sport very opportunistically. In the US, of course, there's these like evangelical or religious groups, Heritage Foundation, Alliance Defending Freedom, that are suddenly the defenders of women's rights in sport, and of course they adopt a very paternalistic language of protecting women in sport, and they've had absolutely nothing to say at all about gender disparities, actual forms of violence and harassment of and abuse of women in sport. Nothing to say about underrepresentation of women in coaching roles, male dominance of leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So they're only using sport for their own sort of opportunistic purposes. And I guess where the most disappointing part of that has been is in seeing people who are really spokespeople for women's rights get on that bandwagon just to really try to make the existence of trans women in particular just impossible. And I'm thinking here of Reem Al-Salam, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. And her case is interesting because when she took a position on violence against women and girls in sport and chose to define trans women and women with intersex variations as a primary source of violence against women and girls in sport, she also really kind of betrayed her own feminist values. Not mean the most, for me, the most striking example was that she actually joined an event hosted by these conservative far right actors in the US who mobilize around ending access to abortion across the world, in the US and across the world, like Alliance Defending Freedom. And she was willing to stand with them just in order to be able to attack trans women. And you just think, like, at what cost for all women when this happens? So, yeah, what I see is just how much all women lose out because of the ways in which these groups and these individuals who purportedly work in support of women's rights actually end up throwing all women under the bus.
Yeah, that word protection is whatever you want it to be, and it is really tragic is like not strong enough of a word to see how much in the name of protecting women's sports you actually are causing harm to literally all women, not just the 1% to 3% that you are targeting, which is horrific on multiple fronts, obviously. Um, Shifting gears slightly, because we've seen a lot of trans eligibility regulations, particularly for international federations and national governing bodies. They don't necessarily overtly exclude trans women. Instead, they state that if trans women want to compete in the female category, they must not have experienced any male puberty beyond Tanner stage 2 or before age 12, whichever is later. And if we take this at face value, this could be argued, and international federations do argue that it is a way of including trans women. They're not overtly saying they can't compete. They just have to adhere to this regulation, this standard. World Aquatics, International Judo Federation, World Athletics, World Sailing have all taken this approach, and they've argued it is a way of including. But you and I have talked about, and you've also written about and argued that this approach raises serious ethical questions about bodily autonomy and coercion, and is essentially a way it is excluding trans people without explicitly doing so. Can you elaborate a bit more on why this is an exclusionary method, and what kind of ethical, medical, scientific integrity values are being violated in this? Can you explain, and why is this actually very problematic to do it this way?
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, you really, really often hear people suggest this as a solution that, like, I know what we can do. Like, let's just have a third category, and we can sort of put everyone in there that doesn't fit in the other categories, and then everything will be okay. It will be sort of the way it's supposed to be. Or the other approach, which is just as problematic, is to leave the women's category as it is, which is, we're going to define it very narrowly in these people's imagination. And then we'll just open up the men's category. And the men's category will be this, like, sort of everyone was welcome, open category. And anyone who doesn't fit in the women's category can go and compete in the other one. And both of those concepts, or supposed solutions, suffer from the same flaws, basically. One being that it's completely removed from the actual desires and practices of transgender people, and the majority of trans people I've had the privilege to speak with would never turn up and compete in a third category, or in a so-called open category, which everyone will continue to interpret as a men's category or a male category. And yeah, certainly the trans women in particular that I know and have spoken about this with have said that this is just it's a way of claiming you're not exclusionary while in practice being entirely okay with exclusion. Of course, it also, for some people would require them to out themselves as being trans or as having certain intersex variations. And so they would not be safe to come out and compete in this category. And then it just in practice, of course, it completely undermines the actual identities of the women in particular who are being asked to compete in these categories. It's just always really disingenuous, I find, on the part of World Athletics and other organizations when they say that, oh, no, we're not questioning these athletes' identities. It's not our job to do that. We're just simply focusing on the biology, as if there are no consequences for their actions for the lived experiences of the people affected. So, yeah, I think third category is a great idea for non-binary athletes, and especially for athletes are asking for that category. But as soon as you get, I guess that's the distinction. There's a very important difference between athletes who are asking for that category and this category being imposed by sports governing bodies onto athletes. And the moment it becomes an imposition, we know that we need to look for the harmful effects of that structure.
All right. Well, speaking of the harmful effects of structures, what do you think the future holds for trans and intersex athletes, especially in the context of this idea of creating more inclusive sporting spaces? Are you optimistic or not?
I think I oscillate a little between being optimistic and feeling quite pessimistic. I think our best hope is that we actually ensure opportunities for trans people to exist in sport, to continue to exist in sport, and to actually force encounters, like real life encounters. I mean, like very often and in fact, almost always, debates around trans women in particular in women's sport are happening in this complete abstract silo, totally removed from the actual trans women who exist in sport and want to continue to exist in sport. And that's kind of by design, actually. And that's another sort of consequence of these policies of sports governing bodies, is that it makes sure that there won't be these encounters that could potentially lead cisgender people to actually see the humanity of trans people, and in the case of women, to see that actually this woman is a woman just like I am. As long as it stays an abstract debate, you can avoid those human encounters. And I think the same thing about women with intersex variations. Actually, it's quite convenient that these new policies, and of course this was always the case before as well. Like they're often being implemented at the national level, far away from the countries where these decisions are being taken, and where these policies are being debated. Like the UK, for example, does actually have an outsized influence on the policy decisions that international sports governing bodies take. What happens in the media in the UK is far more consequential than what happens in the media in Burundi, for example. And so that just, of course, it shows the completely uneven nature of international sports governance and how it's just tipped towards countries located in the global north and certain countries in particular. But again, if these, for example, now the mandatory chromosome screening is happening far away, out of sight, out of mind, we'll never have to really, face the actual consequences of what that looks like in practice for the the women and the girls that are impacted by that. So that's, again, it's kind of by design. Like, the idea is we won't be able to put a face to these policies. Like, we won't have a Caster Semenya, for example, like we did in 2009, who became the human being that people were forced to actually recognize. So that's where I guess the pessimism is it's that, structurally, there's a lot of forces working against us. But I am also optimistic, because I've, especially in recent months, as news is being sort of rip-fed out of the IOC, and we're getting a picture of where they might be heading with a new policy, and we're expecting it to be an exclusionary one. The amount of sort of the groundswell of support that I've seen from advocacy groups, from academics, from athletes, from so many different organizational locations and countries and areas of expertise and so on and so forth. Like, there's actually a lot of us that have expertise that's relevant to this and are really committed to ensuring a more just system in sport, an inclusive system in sport. And we just need to get a little bit better organized. I think that's the challenge. But it's like what we need is there. We have the expertise, the capacity, the heart. We have the commitment to this. And we, I guess I can think of Bad Bunny and the Super Bowl halftime show. Like, what will overcome hate is love, and there's a lot of love out there for trans athletes and for athletes with intersex variations. And certainly, I love these athletes. I love all the trans women that I know and women with intersex variations that I know. And I do believe that we're on the right side of history, and that we can prevail in this space.
That's a perfect segue to the final question I have, just really quickly, because it can seem really hard to change structures. But what is one thing for listeners, for us, that anyone who cares about this issue, what is one thing that they could do to move the needle even just a little bit towards making sport more inclusive, empathetic, and equitable?
Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, something I can share from the time that I spent working with the IOC for a few years is that they do actually pay attention to the letters they receive. So, and they would know, as would any other researcher who spent time in the archives, that the IOC receives a lot of letters, and they get, stamped and put in a folder somewhere. And maybe we don't know who they go to, who reads them, who sees them. But what I saw, and I hope that this practice remains the same, but what I saw was that the letters that the IOC received in the time that I was there were circulated internally, discussed, a response constructed, and even if that response was boilerplate, it still forced a conversation behind closed doors. So, I really actually believe in forcing that response. There was recently an open letter from Sport and Rights Alliance that went to the IOC, and I don't know if they will get a response. And I don't know to what extent it was discussed behind closed doors, but I would bet that it was. And every little reminder, even if it's just from individuals, actually. I mean, I saw letters that came from just random people that were writing into the IOC president and asking for action around the regulation of the women's category. So, if the people that are for exclusion can do it, then the people that are for inclusion can certainly do it as well. So that's, I think, one little practical piece of advice I would have is just to not underestimate the value of having your voice registered with these organizations.
Amazing. I'm a person of action, so I love having like a tangible thing to do. And I hope that our listeners are also motivated and have learned a lot in this and write letters and speak out and use your voice. Maddie, this was literally just like the highlight of my week. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and chatting with me and Nathan about this really important topic and sharing your expertise. It was an absolute delight and joy. Thank you so, so much.
You bet. Do you want the email address?
Yes.
Because I think, well, I mean, I think what I can go to is, so if it goes to the press office, basically the media relations team, they will then have to figure out how to respond or not, but there'll at least be a discussion. It's pressoffice@olympic.org.
You heard it here, friends and comrades. That's where you need to send your letters and emails to, coming straight from Maddie Pape, who, again, thank you so much for being here with us today, Maddie.
Thank you so much for this conversation.